Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School and the co-sponsors of this conference, the Harvard Yenjing Institute and the Humanities Center at Harvard, I would like to welcome all of you here. This afternoon's address will kick off, as you know, an all-day conference tomorrow on the theme Rethinking the Human. I wanted to make just a couple of announcements in regard to tomorrow, that the speakers tomorrow will begin at 9 o'clock in the morning. Lunch will be provided in the Braun Room, which is at the end of this hall for all attendees, and there will be a reception at the end of the conference at the Center for the Study of World Religions, which is just across the street in that low building that, when it was initially built, apparently was referred to euphemistically as God's Motel. Today's speaker, Homi Bhabha, needs no introduction, is well known, I suspect, to all of you. He is the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities in the Department of English at Harvard. He is also the Director of the Humanities Center here. Before joining the Harvard faculty in 2001, Professor Bhabha held appointments at the University of Sussex and the University of Chicago, and visiting professorships at the University of Pennsylvania and University College London. Professor Bhabha, named by Newsweek as one of 100 Americans for the next century, is very much in demand both nationally and internationally as a lecturer and a consultant. To suggest their scope, let me mention but a small fraction of them. The presidential lecture at the Freie Universität in Berlin, keynote addresses for the Colloquium on Research and Higher Education organized by UNESCO, the Beckman Lectures at the University of California, Berkeley, the presidential lectures at Stanford University, the faculty advisor to the Davos World Economic Forum, and on the list goes. A specialist in post-colonial theory, Professor Bhabha's published and forthcoming monographs include Nation and Narration, The Location of Culture, A Global Measure, The Right to Narrate, and A Measure of Dwelling, Reflections on Vernacular Cosmopolitanism. The Location of Culture, which advocates a fundamental realignment of the methodology of cultural analysis in the West, has recently been reprinted as a Routledge classic, and by my most recent count at least, has been translated into 6 languages. Professor Bhabha's challenge to the conceptualization of overlapping migratory movements of cultural identities situates him, I believe, ideally to speak on our theme, Rethinking the Human. In The Location of Culture, he addresses the liminal negotiation of cultural identity across differences of race, class, gender, and cultural traditions in the following manner, and I quote, "It's in the emergence of the interstices, the overlap and displacement of domains of difference, that the intersubjective and collective experiences of nationness, community interest, or cultural value are negotiated. How are subjects formed in between or in excess of the sum of the parts of difference? How do strategies of representation or empowerment come to be formulated in the competing claims of communities where, despite shared histories of deprivation and discrimination, the exchange of values, meanings, and priorities may not always be collaborative and dialogical, but may be profoundly antagonistic, conflictual, and even incommensurable?" The Center of the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School is very honored indeed that Professor Bhabha was able to make time in his busy schedule to deliver the opening lecture of our spring conference, Rethinking the Human. Tomorrow's day-long meeting here in the Sperry Room draws together 6 internationally distinguished speakers and concludes with an open discussion in the late afternoon. It brings to a climax a series of events throughout the academic year, lectures, panel discussion, films devoted to this theme. This afternoon, we look forward very much to Professor Bhabha's keynote address on the barbaric transmission of culture. Please join me in welcoming Homi Bhabha.
John, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon. Don Swearer's very generous introduction really is more than I deserve. He knows better than anyone else how reluctant I was to accept his very wonderful and sincere honor to speak at the start of this conference because of something I knew then, and I know it even better now. Looking around this room, I can count on a number of people who could have done this so much better than I could. But there was one reason why two reasons why I accepted. One was, of course, despite his name, Don has a sylvan and persuasive tongue. If you've ever tried to get emails from him, you know that they are immediately junked because of swearer. So I didn't get a whole lot of emails. The filter catches them. But for a man of divinity, a man of religious belief, to also be a swearer appealed to me. It appealed to me for two reasons, one entirely personal. The closest thing I have to a guru or a holy man is somebody who called Sai Baba, who died, called Sai Baba, who died in the early part of the 20th century. And I make pilgrimages, not as frequent as I would want to the site where Sai Baba had his ashram and where he's buried. And one of the things that most impressed me about him, apart from a great sense of well-being that I get when I make this pilgrimage, is the fact that when he was at his most sublime meditative moment, when he was, as they say, touched by something else, he swore. He swore in the most foul way, and nobody ever questioned his sanctity. And Don, I can hardly say that you're Sai Baba, but there is something. But there is, something about this, this looking beyond the demotic, looking beyond the normative, that attracted me today to take up the challenge of, in some odd way, addressing this subject. Many of you, much better equipped than me, might well be able to do it head on. I can only do it metonymically, tripping a kind of marginal path around this profound question. But the theme of, aura and abuse, or barbarism and civility, or sanctity and swearing are close to what I'm going to try and talk about today. Because in the book that I'm completing, this very well-known line from Walter Benjamin, there is no product of culture that is not, or civilization that is also not also a product of barbarism, is, particularly in the times in which we live, I feel deeply, deeply relevant. But it's the line that follows from that well-known opposition or contradiction that has recently preoccupied me. Benjamin goes on to say, But it is the transmission of barbarism, that is particularly vexing and also particularly important. Now, I'm paraphrasing Benjamin in a tendentious way, but the transmission of barbarism interests me for two reasons. One, because in a way there has to be some form of representing, remembering that barbarism, not as a sanctified, worked through in the Freudian sense, made safe issue. But there must be some affective way in which the transmission of barbarism brings with it some of the anxiety, the indeterminacy, the fear, the terror of barbarism. Otherwise, there is no way in the representation of it of both confronting it and moving beyond it. So this problem has stayed with me, particularly since there is an interesting theory of messianic tradition in Benjamin, but there isn't a theory of transmission, as indeed that early, that bit from the philosophy of history, or the thesis of the philosophy of history mentions it, because in that statement of transmission, there is an enormous emphasis on mediation, philosophical mediation, in moving from one moment to the other, but also on the media. And somehow this is the issue that I'm actually interested in today. Today's paper does not focus on the Benjamin texts. I felt it would, that's a much more seminar style of paper which requires a kind of collective reading of a certain corpus of texts, and I didn't think it would be suitable. But I wanted to start with this, just verbally, with this notion of the transmission of barbarism, both as a kind of signal against it, but as the need to be able to communicate something about it, its pleasure, its passions, its desire, its anxiety, so that we don't simply turn the page on the past and say, never again, as indeed many conventions do, as many laws do, as many right-thinking people do, whereas we know that there will be, and again, and again, and again. So it's part of my thinking that there is this complex ethical and epistemological apparatus where, on the one hand, as much as we work structurally, legally, politically, towards a kind of temporality of transcending barbarism, never again, a transformative discourse, at the same time, ethically, there is a particular kind of demonic repetition which we cannot get caught into, but to which we have to give also a place in our ethical and political thinking. The talk follows the interdisciplinary trajectory of the book, and there are various kinds of textual materials. I thought I might just give you a short map of how and where I'll go. I start off by thinking through this problem of barbarism and civility from a sort of tangential angle by looking at our current political moment, particularly as a moment of a certain kind of messianic politics. My text there will be T.S. Eliot, partly because I believe that, as I will show, that T.S. Eliot's work represents a particular kind of understanding of the messianic as a form of the civilizational in the very midst of what most people see as a great icon of modernism. So when we hear about messianic thinking in other cultural traditions, and we always say, but we don't know what this is. This has got nothing to do with us. I want to suggest that, in fact, in the body of Eliot's work, there is precisely this kind of messianic moment that allows us to understand other forms of cultural messianism, whether or not we agree with them or support them. From then, I move on to a particularly personal narrative of an instance of my own experience of the deep ambivalence in the experience of barbarism and its memories. I then move on to putting that event in a larger context, the context of the work of Hannah Arendt, who I believe produced one of the most enduring theories of political rights and human, as she put it, human connectedness or human coming together in the shadow of the barbaric, maintaining, drawing from the barbaric some lessons and transforming them. And finally, I will return at the end to literature, my home base. I hope this tour d'horizon helps. I hope not to be much longer than I need to be. The war on terror, fought in the name of global democracy and homeland security, is often frequently represented in the spatial language of terror networks, axes of evil, rogue states, and failed states. The cultural life of the war, however, is, I believe, being waged not so much in spatial terms, but against time itself. A commonplace expression of such temporal warfare is manifested in the chronotope, the spatio-temporal matrix of meanings, images, or practices, through which cultural differences are represented, for instance, in the discourse of the clash of civilizations. In his essay, Reflections on Blasphemy, written in the aftermath of the War on Terror, Talal Asad lays out the terms of such chronotopic classifications as they intensify under the pressures of political events and new diasporic demographic patterns. Although he writes of Europe, the global relevance of his thinking in this passage is not difficult to detect. I quote from Asad, "Liberal Europeans have repeatedly said that modernity, their modernity, consists precisely in the continuous recreation of individual experiences and political economic futures through the exercise of auto-critique. Yet, in their relation to European Muslims, a limit seems to have been reached, a limit that is insupportable. Their conception of criticism is motivated by the dark face of religion, ours by secular debate, democratic openness, and joyous satire." Mahmoud Mamdani adds a sinister footnote to Assad's description of a fatally forked future of modernity, when in Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, he writes of the increased sense, post 9/11, of the other as depicting the pre-modern as well as the anti-modern. Culture, Mamdani states, is now said to be a matter of life and death. What happens to the times of our lives when this temporal and conceptual limit seems to have been reached? And the future of contemporary modernity, its self-transformative structures, its linearity, its telos, is deemed to be in peril. There is, I would like to suggest briefly, a new chronotope in circulation that has emerged both in the public protean discourse and in the language of theoretical reflection. It is commonly acknowledged as a temporality of our time a temporality of endlessness, time without end, space without closure, anticipation without expectation. And, dear friends, it is not post-modernity. What times are these? This war is an endless war, and the most compelling cinematic interpretation of Iraq's tragedy is Charles Ferguson's recent film, appropriately titled No End in Sight. It is an endless war, Susan Sontag wrote just before she died, because it is boundless and borderless, a war that has been pushed past, she writes, the acceptable limits of international laws of war and its humanitarian conventions, beyond the pale of norms of civil endurance and military honor. Endless war is taken to justify endless incarcerations. This endless global war on terrorism leads to dehumanization and demonization. Susan Sontag. War is the wrong metaphor for the never-ending duration of this deeply ideological, civilizing mission, argues Francis Fukuyama, because, and I quote, wars are fought at full intensity and have clear beginnings and endings, while meeting the jihadist challenge is more of a long twilight struggle whose core is not a military campaign, but political contest for the minds and hearts of ordinary Muslims around the world. For Jacques Derrida, twilight struggle would be an apt metaphor for the unforeseeable threat of terror that makes this war an indeterminate engagement, a war whose real time belongs to the stealth and suddenness of the future. Quote Derrida again, a piece I think he wrote fairly just before he died. Because of the anonymous invisibility of the enemy, because of the undetermined origin of the terror, traumatism is produced by the future, by the threat of the worst to come, rather than an aggression that is over and done with. It seems to me this concept of endlessness, and everybody says the last election was won on the argument that the war is endless. I had at the Humanities Center somebody who had been in Bush's legal office. He said, I'm 42, the war is endless. And by this, I really don't want you to focus on a kind of fetishism of terroristic activity. That's not my point. My point is that there is in the discourse consistently and continuously, not only here, in India, in other parts of the world that I know, this notion of an everyday or quotidian endlessness. And it is not only something that is suffered by ourselves, it is much more intensely suffered, this sense of endlessness, by almost every Baghdadi that I have talked to. This idea that it will go on, it goes on, we don't know where we're being taken. And so endlessness is not really about searching so much for an end as trying to deal with the present. And that's what I want to talk about, this notion of waiting in the present. And in this country now, we seem to be waiting for the Democratic nominee. So the war, as you might have noticed, really plays second fiddle to the general celebration. And this I also find deeply troubling. There is, as you well know, an opposing and antagonistic discourse of endless war deployed by neoconservative hawks, but that is not the Chronotope, but the Chronotope to which I want to turn our attention today. I won't go into this in detail, but I give you just one reason why. Whereas the hawkish perspective on war, security and foreign policy, is formulated in terms of a temporality of preemption, defense as the capture and appropriation of the future, anybody's future, in defense of my own security, an appropriation of the future as a national or imperial entity, The instances I have provided of the endless are part of what Talal Asad called autocritique, that attenuate and alienate the self-fulfilling claims of contemporaneity and national sovereignty. The disturbance of the contemporary moment reveals a kind of messianic interpretation, a waiting for the indeterminate future in the midst of the ambivalences of wartime. At times we are confronted in the midst of endless waiting with a messianic memory, the repetition of the traumatic past as if it were the future to come. What was I doing last year at this very moment? Asks Riverbend, the girl blogger from Baghdad, whose means of action are her diaries that open up dialogues with the rest of the world. Let me quote. I was listening for the sirens, listening for the planes, and listening to the bombs. Dreams of being stuck under the rubble or feeling the earth shudder beneath me as the windows rattle ominously. I know it is to do with the fact that every day we relive a little bit of the war on television, on radio, on the internet. I woke up to the sound of explosions and gunfire last night, and for one terrible moment I thought that someone had warped me back a whole year, and we should have to relive this last year of our lives over and over again. Kind of a messianic memory. So the past is put in place of the future, and yet with it there is this waiting for something. At other times, as in Ian McEwan's remarkable post-9/11 novel Saturday, a kind of messianic waiting, the threat of the trauma to come, creates an endless repetition of an unknowable future, as if it were not elsewhere, but uncannily camouflaged, concealed, rather than hidden, in the most familiar statuary of one's customary life. I quote, London, his small part of it, now lies wide open, impossible to defend, waiting for its bomb like 100 other cities. The authorities agree an attack's inevitable. He, however, lives in different times. Because the newspapers say so, it doesn't mean it's true. But from the top of his day, this is a future that's harder to read, a horizon indistinct with possibilities. In suggesting that the chronotope of endlessness is a kind of messianic temporality, a waiting time of interruption and interpretation, as visceral as it is figural, contemplative and critical, I do not mean to anticipate utopia or recommend redemption. Mine is a weak messianism, in Benjamin's phrase, that hovers uncertainly between the secular and the sacred, between literature, politics, and philosophy, in between the traumatic future and the projected past. In raising the issue of the spectral memory of messianism, its endlessness, in the midst of the teleologies of modernity, I want to suggest that we, both East and West, North and South, know from our shared imperialist and nationalist histories all there is to know, almost all there is to know, about the intimate agonism between forces of emancipation and evisceration that make, in Mamdani's memorable phrase, culture a matter of life and death. My tropic use of the messianic in the midst of the messiness of endless temporality of wartime is, of course, deeply indebted to Derrida's definition of messianicity. Messianicity, he writes, which I regard as a universal structure of experience and which cannot be reduced to any religious messianism of any stripe, is anything but utopian. It refers to every here and now, to the coming of an eminently real, concrete event that is to the most irreducibly heterogeneous otherness, an active preparation, but also exposure without horizon, and therefore an irreducible amalgam of desire and anguish, affirmation and fear, promise and threat, barbarism and civilization, both working together, the fear, the anxiety, and the hope for transformation. This agonizing messianism, this messianic moment that is absolutely part of the examination of the here and now as a form of time in which any appeal to the future comes to be nested. It's this moment that I want to hold on to, this difficult, traumatic, and yet transformational moment. And of course, this is quite close to what Benjamin called the destructive character who is not simply destructive in a negative sense, but comes out of a long twisting of the ongoing narrative of barbarism and civility, and that destruction is in a way another kind of initiation, another emergence. In the midst of this trauma, it's Benjamin's anti-Hegelianism, but in a very affectively and visually compelling formulation. In the midst of this trauma of the unbearability of endlessness and its messianic here and now, I cannot stop hearing the song of the thrush from T.S. Eliot's poem, Burnt Norton. Go, 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 said the bird. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Time past and time future. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Burnt Norton is renowned for its metaphysical and spiritual meditations on the still point of the turning world. The poet, awakened by the bird, follows the via sanctiva of Buddha, St. John of the Cross, the Bhagavad Gita, the idealist monism of F.H. Bradley. In his own melancholic and Mandarin way, Eliot was also profoundly engaged with the turning world in a much more contemporary sense. A world turned inside out by war. War, in Eliot's verse, is both a metaphor of spiritual and psychic struggle. To quote him, the inner freedom from the practical desire. But in the mid-30s, and Burnt Norton was published in 1936, Europe was a theater of fascist and anti-fascist wars. The Spanish Civil War, the Italo-Ethiopian War, the German reoccupation of the Rhineland. If war for Eliot is a metaphor for the messianic struggle of the soul, liberation for the future as well as the past, as he describes it, then war is also a metaphor for a civilizational struggle to preserve and transmit the hieratic values of an elite, Eurocentric classical culture committed to the maintenance of hegemony on a global scale. The aesthetic scale of Eliot's concept of the classic is deeply embedded, as any reader knows, in the extensive geopolitical scale of an imperial culture, be it ancient Rome or modern Britain. And of course, there are very few essays on Eliot as a war poet. And it seems to me that the inner struggle and the outer struggle, the struggle for the construction of the classical imperium, as well as the inner struggle, can only be seen as coming together when you actually put him in that context. Liberty is good, Eliot writes, with sympathy for Machiavelli. But more important is order. Order in this context must be understood as something more than regulatory force of political power. Order signifies the representational authority of a classical civilizational genealogy that struggles to establish the global preeminence of Eurocentric cultural, ethical, and aesthetic values as, and I quote Eliot, an empire and a language with a unique destiny in relation to ourselves. Despite the fact that What is a Classic was written in 1944 during the darkest nights of barbarism, Eliot keeps faith with that unique destiny and extends it beyond the ourselves of the European Christian domain to argue for its centrality in establishing nothing less than a world order. For we need to remind ourselves, he writes, that Europe is a whole and still in its progressive mutilation and disfigurement, that organism out of which any other greater world harmony and world culture must develop. Eliot's poetic ideas and ideals, then, give us an insight into the fervid ascending scale of affective and political values that can transform a fierce regionalist and nationalist cultural affiliation into a deterritorialized metaphysical aspiration to global sovereignty. What starts as the expression of amor patriae, the passionate identification with a cultural territorial location and tradition, Eliot's words, love of a country as attachment to our own field of action. And please listen to the field of action in relation to other war poems of this time. Very often action is read so ontologically in Eliot that there's a whole other vocabulary, there's a whole other history of a field of action, which in my view has really never fully been read. Love of a country as attachment to our own field of action is followed by a temporal anxiety fueled by a fearful sense of the loss of civilizational order and historic sovereignty. History may be servitude, he writes, history may be freedom, after which comes the apocalyptic vision of holy terror that signifies the realization of divine justice, even when it defies the secular representation of that state of being. The dove descending breaks the air with flames of incandescent terror. The only hope, or else despair, lies in the choice of pyre or pyre, to be redeemed from fire by fire. Even more directly relevant to the geopolitical problems towards which I draw Eliot on a transnational scale are the following lines that explore the complex sublimatory relationship in his work between social anxiety and pious perplexity with the background of war. When there is distress of nations and perplexity, whether on the shores of Asia or in the Edgware Road, men's curiosity searches past and future and clings to that historic dimension, but to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. You can imagine how surprised I was, having read Eliot for 30 years, now to have read about the disturbances or the distress of nations and perplexity, not simply nations in dissatisfaction or revolution, and perplexity on the shores of Asia or on the Edgware Road. The scale between the shores of Asia and the Edgware Road, I mean, the comparative scale is also kind of, I think, rather interesting here. Eliot's messianic global mission, carried out in the name of holy fire and an incandescent civilizational order, speaks to the messianic conflicts and concepts of our time. Eliot understands the modernity of the messianic spirit. In the space of a few verses, through the efficacy of a voice, meter, and image, he makes it possible for us to inhabit the temporal rhythm of a history in waiting, a history of waiting, whether or not we identify with its ideas or accept its ideologies. Eliot himself would have had little difficulty in embracing the form, if not the content, which he certainly would not have embraced, of the jihadi's messianic vision of the future as a caliphate, as Faisal Devji describes it in his excellent recent essay, Landscapes of the Jihad. More a metaphysical category than a political vision. The caliphate's role allows, as Devji writes, the jihad to abandon the political geography of the Cold War, made up of national states, for a completely deterritorialized space, since the caliphate imagined by the jihad possesses neither center nor periphery. In four quartets, we also experience, however, a sudden surprising shift, a move to the corporeal, heterogeneous moment in the messianic discourse that reveals the here and now of anguish and anticipation, promise and threat. There are moments when Eliot lifts his messianic drape, the intolerable shirt of flame which human power cannot remove, in order to reveal the historic human body and its fate, marked by instruments of war, traumatized by violence and terror. The trilling wire in the blood sings below the inveterate scars, appeasing long-forgotten wars. Now, this is a famously uninterpreted and difficult passage in Eliot. Nobody seems to know what the trilling wire is. And it so happens that because I'm now reading bits of Eliot that people don't comment on in this way, I took it on a challenge to understand. So I looked at James Fenton's recent essays, really quite a remarkable reader of both Eliot and Auden. And James Fenton, in one of his recent Oxford lectures on poetry, cites this phrase and says, now come on, what is a trilling wire? He says, I think it's a telegram written to Lionel Trilling. I thought this was wonderful. But I think there is more to be said if you follow my line of argumentation as to what a trilling wire is. If you go back to the Old English and find out, what the etymology of trilling. The trilling wire is an instrument of a darker human reality. For to trill, etymologically, is also to twist, to turn, to revolve, to rotate, a wire turning, twisting, revolving, rotating, as if the scarred body of torqued flesh, like a figure by the artist Francis Bacon, is a tortured, disfigured icon of the turning world, turning around the human form. Inveterate scars, long-forgotten wars, scars, wars, echoing end rhymes bring each other back to life in the memory of defilement and death, ensuring that no violence is lost to human memory, no terror forgotten by human history. If the historical scars are inveterate, deep-seated, chronic, resisting treatment, then the trauma of war and torture cannot simply be appeased. Appeasement is, in any case, never a sign of peace. It is at best a form of pacification, a stilling of the nerves, a hiding of the scars as you wake in the middle of the night. My own experience of this kind of messianic remembering happened in Nuremberg. It was my encounter with a global event that was, in Derrida's words, irreducibly other to my own immediate natal history, and yet quite properly messianic in another sense, in the sense that all human beings wait for that history of alterity. They have to wait for it. They wait for it as individual subjects. Without the alterity, you do not know who you are. Without the otherness, you do not know who you are. And you wait for it. There is this messianic waiting for the other's history before you begin to locate yourself fully in your own history, particularly if the idea of a global history is on the horizon of your thinking. It lay await for me like a horizonless future that would also become my historic fate. It was an unsettled, wet morning in late May. The rain skidded across the windscreen, blinding us for a moment, and then suddenly clearing, giving us no hint of what kind of day we were to expect. My host, a German professor from Munich, suddenly suggested that we make a stop in Nuremberg. You must see Nuremberg. I must take you there. Absent-mindedly, I said, where and why? And then, oh, what a good idea. I vaguely remembered a film about the Nuremberg trials with Spencer Tracy and Marlene Dietrich, Judgment at Nuremberg, seen in Bombay as a child, much before I knew anything about Albert Speer or the millions of Nazis who frequently gathered in what Hitler called the city of the rallies. Just these distant recollections, the heinous echolalia of Hitler's high-pitched ravings, and a tired, overused phrase from Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil, trailed in my mind as we drove off the Autobahn, and after some innocuous suburban maneuvering, arrived at the Zeppelin-Feld, Hitler's massive parade ground. The vast stadium of soaring stone and empty, crumbling terraces was soundless, where hundreds of thousands once stood to rapturous, roaring attention. Today in the rain, there were only a few of us, a man scraping the rust of his car, children baiting a dog, a few of us tourists and visitors at a loss for words, and what was far worse, without any sense of how to behave, where to look, what truism of history or barbarism to utter. Nobody wanted to climb onto the pinnacle of the Zeppelin tribune, to stand at the podium and assume Hitler's viewpoint from which he commanded the attention of his followers. Nobody pointed a camera at anything or anybody. There was no photograph to take home, no quick family group, no memento of the children at play. In the Zeppelin-Feld, now overgrown with weeds and grasses, its serried balconies chipped and bruised, its colonnades long since demolished. The site was neither background to our lives nor foreground. It was largely, strangely there and nowhere. How do you dispossess a cultural space, a heritage site that has developed a global resonance and a demonic presence? How do you dispossess a site or subject of the past that is at once tangible and intangible, and yet preserves and protects the traumatic heritage of its memory, without which history is silenced and memory made mute? Guilt, reparation, apology, truth, and reconciliation. These are important moral dispositions and political strategies that strive to surmount the internecine violence of nations and states in transition by practicing the virtue of public confession and the balm of collective introspection. But there is nothing in the ethic of ameliorative witnessing, however sincere in its pursuit of human fairness, however necessary, however transformative tomorrow, however informative of historic justice, that prepares you today for the vacuum that such dispossessed cultural monuments create, the half-life of heritage, on the other side of which lies the death of human culture. As I stood in this place of barbaric cultural transmission, if I may coin a phrase, I was startled to hear a loud, triumphant roar, a raucous chorus of celebration that rose from somewhere behind a bank of trees. I froze. Was I hallucinating? Alexander Kluger's remarkable film, Brutality in Stone, that explores the architectural tomb of the half-dead Zeppelin tribune, flashed before my eyes. It brought back those voices, Hitler, Himmler, anonymous camp commandants, that Kluge had dug up from the Nazi archive to create his own montage of memory. These dispossessed moments and monuments, merely mortal and marble, are not free of the morality of human choice. An internationalism relevant to our global age, David Held writes in Global Covenant, must take the most brutal episodes as a starting point and build an ethically sound and politically robust conception of the proper basis of political community around it. I like Held's proposal, not because there is not a sense of entirely transforming the brutality, but actually no utopian idea of overcoming, but using it and remembering it, and yet not being caught in its endless downward spiral. Held's proposal has a moral urgency at a time in which, post 9/11, internationalism seems to have yielded to unilateralism, and cosmopolitanism, for all its claims, is threatened by a new global empire. But beyond these exigent considerations, Held evokes a humane tradition of civility and peacemaking that prevails in the preambles of most international rights conventions. But is there another story to be told about the barbaric cultural transmission of history's brutal and global memories? Perhaps the most salutary instance in which brutality becomes the starting point for conceiving of an ethically sound political community is to be found in Hannah Arendt's concept of the right to have rights, which is now both becoming more and more significant, more and more debated in the context of an international civil society. Arendt traces the origins of this idea to the brutish, as you know, teeming lives of the stateless between the wars and after the Nazi ascendancy. We became aware of the existence of the right to have rights, she writes, only when millions of people emerged who had lost and could not regain these rights because of the new global political situation. It is the non-foundationalist basis of the right to have rights which particularly interests me, that it is not necessarily linked each time to reading rights in terms of territorial identifications. It really proleptically looks beyond to a much more interesting notion of citizenship, which is not always tied to a specific territorial institution or territorial agreements. Statelessness, Arendt argues, is not a calamity caused by a lack of civilization. It is, on the contrary, the perverse conditions of the political and cultural situations of a kind of modernity. In an integrated world system of nation-states, there is no free space, no proper place for the right to action and opinion, for the stateless, for refugees, for minorities, for displaced persons. The people and not the individual was the image of man, Arendt brilliantly observed, and those who have been thrown out of one of these tightly organized, closed communities find themselves thrown out of the family of nations altogether. The brutal post-war experience of being thrown out of the family of nations is Arendt's starting point. And this experience of statelessness yields a fascinating insight into the dialectical structure of an interrelated global internationalism that consists of interlocking lives, projects, and communities. If the global is an extensive, totalizing condition of equivalent moral and social units, then all forms of social transformation or contradiction, whether their effects are progressive, affiliative, antagonistic, or alienating, emerge out of the global itself. There is no outside to the global system. Whatever alienates global interdependency or annihilates its cosmopolitan values must be seen to be an effect of its internal dialectic, a demonic dynamic of the global condition itself. Deadly danger to any global civilization or any claim to global civilization is no longer likely to come from without. Arendt writes, the danger is that a global, universally interrelated civilization produces barbarians from within its own midst by forcing millions of people every day, different times, into conditions which, despite all appearances, are the conditions of savages. Now, what kind of monstrous birthplace is this when barbarism emerges from the sack of the civil aspiration to globalism and seeks succor at its teats? The stateless, whose witness is crucial to the ethics and politics of a new internationalism, stand neither at the center nor at the margins of society. The metaphor is deeply attractive and suggestive, but I believe it is wrong. They emerge from within the midst of the ambivalent internal dialectic of the global condition, often spoken of as surplus populations, but in real terms the motor of unorganized labor and service industries. As illegals, undocumented, sans-papiers, they may be hidden from legality, but in their invisibility they become crucial, ubiquitous presences in the everyday material lives of civil society and the public sphere, caught very much in the interstices, not in the margins. From a February 2004 policy brief, the Pew Hispanic Center estimates that in 2001, undocumented workers comprised 58% of the workforce in agriculture, 23.8% in private household services, 16% in business services, 19% in restaurants, and 6% in construction. The stateless, migrant workers, minorities, asylum seekers, refugees represent emergent, undocumented life worlds that break through the formal legal language of protection and status because, as Balibar writes, they are neither insiders or outsiders. Insiders officially considered outsiders. Their indeterminate liminal presence, legal, illegal, turns cosmopolitan claims of global ethical equivalences and interrelationships into the chains of international alienage. As insider-outsiders, they damage the cosmopolitan dream of a world without borders or l'humanité sans frontières by opening up in the interstices, in the midst of international polity, a complex and contradictory way of being or surviving somewhere in between legality and incivility. It is a kind of no man's land that in the world of migration shadows global success. It frequently splits ethical obligations, family and community obligations behind the border from economic interests, foreign labor markets, economic migrancy across the border. It substitutes cultural survival in migrant milieu for civic participation. Arendt's condition of statelessness opens up then a space of double articulation in the midst of the discourse of global polity. Here, the universally interrelated principles of international integration, civility, cosmopolitanism, rights conventions, global covenants, transnational citizenship, overlapping communities of fate are confronted in a kind of double bind of civilization and barbarism with the contingent conditions of disintegration, exclusion, violence, injustice, security, and discrimination. But it is this palimpsestical arrangement of the two that gives depth to our contemporaneity, that also creates a kind of blindness for us. It is the in-between presence, the continual liminal movement that I believe needs to be tracked in these issues. The contingency of time and space that I associate with these forces of disintegration and integration, the ambivalence of barbarism and civility, are, I believe, acutely expressed by W.E.B. Du Bois in his figurative account of what it means to live under the shadow of the color line, somewhere just on the limits of the segregated state. Asked by a sympathetic white friend whether racial discrimination and civic exclusion happens to you each day, Du Bois answers, and this I think is one of the most profound enactments of what I've been saying, not all each day, surely not, but now and then, now seldom, now sudden, now after a week, now in a chain of awful minutes, not everywhere, but anywhere, in Boston, in Atlanta. That's the hell of it. Imagine spending your life either looking for insults or hiding places from them, shrinking from blows that are not always, but ever. And it is this contingent and yet interstitial exchange or encounter which I think is absolutely central to our understanding the phenomenological location of the stateless, the migrant, or the refugee. Not, and this is why the perpetual pressure of the law, as it were, important than it is, if I might put it in that way, the perpetual pressure, the structural, never quite is able to deal with the politics of affectivity and the whole phenomenological issue of being or naming. And that's why I think that temporality, which is often seen as such an abstract analytic measure, is often as important, if not more, I have a stake in this, if not more, than the usual analytics of exclusion, which are so much based on spatial models. And my work has often tried to mine the temporal, because it's there, I feel, that some question, that agony and agency, anxiety and transformation seem to come together. The temporality seems, in my view, to be absolutely as important. And most of Du Bois's work, and my book has a couple of chapters on Du Bois, in its own poetic way, is continually talking about this problem. Not about the body being perpetually marked, or wholly marked, or half-marked, but about this flashing identification, this partializing, the politics of partial identification. And I think the politics of partial identification become more and more important as we, in our time. The double bind of universality and contingency that shackles the life of minority subjects or stateless groups is articulated in a discourse that is contradictory and ambivalent. Integration and disintegration intersect in an unresolved dialectic that expresses the ongoing tension within values, norms, and beliefs in determining what is legal, but what may be unjust, and what may be illegal, but ethically and politically fair. It is by working through or living through the process of ambivalence, its tensions and contentions, that we derive a more appropriate, if agonizing, measure of global ethical and political conflicts. The ambivalent perspectives of contradictory realities, differential aspects, and oblique relations of knowledge differ substantially from what Richard Rorty once described as the metaphor of epistemological truth, and I quote him, as being that of having our beliefs determined by being brought face to face with the object of belief. The subject of ambivalence that moves back and forth, hither and thither, the partial subject that I've talked about, individual or collective, must not be hastened or chastened, even though it seems to be out of time with the accelerative technologies and mentalities of global power. Thus, a public, Kant writes in What is Enlightenment, can only achieve wisdom slowly. Ambivalence fosters a vigilant ethics of process and procedure, of partiality and agency, of means and mediation. For instance, on the question of transnational citizenship, the legal scholar Linda Bosniak resorts to what I'm calling an analytic of ambivalence, because every time you talk about ambivalence, they translate you as talking about ambiguity. There may be ambiguity in ambivalence, but the dialectic, the unresolved dialectical structure of ambivalence, identifying with and against at the same time is profoundly more important and profoundly more anxiety creating, an anxiety which I believe is politically absolutely necessary for any form of citizenship. For instance, on the question of transnational citizenship, the legal scholar Linda Bosniak resorts in her excellent book to an analytic of ambivalence as she draws her argument to a close. Aliens are liminal characters, subjects of contrasting and sometimes competing worlds. The worlds are ultimately inseverable at the point of alienage because it is alienage's very condition to be at their interface. Our condition, she concludes, is one of ambivalence in ethical conflict. On the importance of public reason as part of an ethics of ambivalence, Amartya Sen emphasizes the importance of speaking ambivalently from the midst of moments of contingency or transition. Habermas, in his recent writings on tolerance, also accedes to what I call the dialectic of ambivalence. If public reason is to be effective, he writes, there has to be an ethic of toleration in the global dialogue that continually puts you in the position of being in the midst of cognitive dissonances that will remain unresolved for the time being, a move away from the earlier Habermas that we are much more used to. Tolerance as a universalist principle of integration must continually endure the unsettling contingency of unresolved contradictions. It is then reasonable to suggest that ambivalence, difficult though it may be, anxiety-provoking though it may be, marks the practice of tolerance and threatens the ethic of endurance. It is strange to think that these elements of a global covenant that I have brought before you, an ambivalent analytic of citizenship, a transitional sense of public reason, and a contradictory yet effective ethic of tolerance, should emerge from my attempt to explore what it means to take history's most brutal episodes as the starting point for an ethics of global community. This genealogy of global ambivalence leads me back to the charnel house of memory as I prepare to end. A few verses from a poem by Adrian Rich explore this global ambivalence in order to provide a political and ethical map to help us in negotiating our difficult world. The poet attempts to establish a moral measure, a combination of poetic meter and political vision, as she narrates a history of global rights and wrongs from the perspective of doubt, ambivalence, or what she calls unsatisfaction. Memory says, want to do the right thing? Don't count on me. I'm a canal in Europe where bodies are floating. I'm a mass grave. I'm the life that returns. I'm a table set with room for the stranger. I'm a field with corners left for the landless. I'm an immigrant tailor who says, a coat is not a piece of cloth only. I have dreamed of Zion. I have dreamed of world revolution. I'm a corpse dredged from a canal in Berlin, a river in Mississippi. I'm a woman standing with other women dressed in black, with naked face, listening. I'm standing here in your poem, unsatisfied. What story do you tell when you realize that barbarism and civilization are too often linked only by an open sewer running with blame, blood, and tears? Early in October 2003, Riverbend, the blogger I started with, wrote, I want something to be done about the Abu Ghraib photographs, and I want it done publicly. I want these horrible soldiers who were responsible for this to be publicly punished and humiliated. I want them, this couldn't be 2003. When were the Abu Ghraib photographs released? 2005, sorry. I want something to be done about it, and I want it done publicly. I want these horrible soldiers who are responsible for this to be publicly punished and humiliated. I want them to be condemned and identified as the horrible people they are. I want their children and their children's children to carry on the story of what was done for a long time, as long as those prisoners will carry along with them the humiliation and pain of what was done, and as long as the memory of those pictures remain in Iraqi hearts and minds. Now, at this point, I have in the book an analysis of Errol Morris's new film, Standard Operating Procedure, which we are showing next week, and which I'm very much in sympathy with, which actually takes a very different line on these. It has many problems with it and many, many great strengths, but it absolutely doesn't take this line that somehow you point a finger at the soldiers. But nor does it explicitly point a finger simply at Rumsfeld, who is out of the frame. It tries to work very much in the way I'm speaking, with the text itself, with the moment-by-moment creation of this barbarism, with people's excuses for it. It's complex in the way in which I'm trying to suggest, but without showing it, it would be very difficult to, at this point, to come to terms with it. But it is the phrase, I want something done about it, and I want it done publicly. The public that Riverbend seeks as judge and jury is in part an international public sphere in which human rights are defended and through which global information is disseminated. The media, military inquiries, Geneva Conventions, the public acknowledgement of the testimony of the tortured and the torturers. She wants a public examination. But as you read on in the blog, beyond the sphere of public opinion as if we know it, there is another public site that Riverbend seeks to realize in her ferocious appeal to a future, to which I cannot entirely agree, but one in which the barbaric event will circulate through the mouths of babes. The children of the American soldiers involved in the recent event must pass on the story from generation to generation, because the shame of Abu-Ghraib is not something that simply happened to the Iraqis. That's the other point. It must be seen as part of the national history of the US and its future citizens, just as much as it must be seen as the history of the world in these particular years. Narrative, that peculiar intersection of words and actions, is part of a moral universe that floods the conscious experience of the present with the disruptive ghosts of memory and draws upon the future that has not yet taken place, this messianic waiting to provide a virtual yet aspirational location for the activity of ethical judgment. The moral witness must continually ask herself or himself, how will I look back upon the principles which determine my present actions in current topics? What impression will my judgments make on the shape of the future? The role of narrative in ethical thinking is caught in this here and now, where the past refuses to die, and the future will not wait to be born. It is this counterfactual site of struggle that creates the place, the position, the enunciation of the moral witness. The repetitions of a fallen past bring back traumatic, unresolved, and unrepresented narratives with a demand that the cultural record be rewritten from this moment on. From the unrealized future comes the aspiration for equity and liberty. A global ethics demands that we take responsibility, imaginatively and actively, for a world that is caught between a past that refuses to die and a future that refuses to be born. A discourse of ethics that compels us to take responsibility for the remembered past while the future warns against the corruptibility of the present. Caught in the ambivalences of these double lives of our times, we tell each other our hybrid stories, part yours, part mine, a part that is written in a language of mixed bits and pieces that is as yet unresolved, caught in the developing of a vocabulary of values and wishes, which engages the yet aleatory aspect of the global world we occupy. The rain didn't stop that day in May, that day long ago in Nuremberg, which I told you about. As we drove away from the Zeppelin-Feld, I was still frozen by that sudden roar of applause that you may have forgotten. Do you still remember it? The roar that had unexpectedly broken the sodden silence, the voiceover that brought the rallying ground back to life as a killing field for an awful moment before it receded into a kind of strange joy. We stopped a child on a bicycle to ask, "Did you hear that shout? Did you hear where it came from?" He looked puzzled and pained all at the same time. He looked surly, turned his eye up at us and said, "Didn't you hear that the visiting team scored a last-minute goal? It's always like that on that bloody football ground. We never seem to win." The boy answered with his eyes turned away from Hitler's parade ground, looking at a wall of trees that blocks off the Nazi ruin from any visual contact with the city's new sports stadium. The Zeppelin-Feld was almost out of sight, separated from the life of the city. Half dead, but half alive. A barbaric memory, surviving history's desolation, yet signifying culture's dispossession. Thank you.
Do you want to stand, or would you prefer to sit?
I don't care. I don't mind.
Professor Bhabha, thank you very, very much for powerful, poetic, and provocative comments. We are at the interstice, or the in-between time, between the end of the lecture and when we will all depart. I think we have probably up to a half hour anyway. So do you want to take questions directly, or would you like me to intercede?
I mean, in this holy place, intercession might be better, but
Fine.
I will.
I will intercede then. So if you would like to sit or stand as it were.
I'm happy.
So I'll take any questions.
Yes.
Yeah, I can't remember who said, and I'm probably misquoting, but if you don't remember history, you're condemned to repeat it. What you seem to be saying is that even if you do remember history, you're condemned?
Not condemned, but that the only way to think about it is to be able to deal with, not to overcome, as it were, entirely the trauma, but to see that there are some elements of that traumatic effect that are that still can create the here and now effect. And this is, I think, why the media is so important. This is very much an argument for a particular kind of media. This is why narrative is so important. This is why conventions, legal conventions, and the professionalization of the problem can only go so far. So in a way, it really is it's when I said to you at the start of it that I'm very interested in this notion, what Benjamin meant by transmission. He said, and this barbarism has to be transmitted. Not that it has to become part of the tradition. I'll give you another when Lanzmann talked about Shoah. I don't know, 20 years ago, there was this conference about Shoah, I think, at Yale, with the Yale faculty and also with the Northeastern Connecticut Psychoanalytic Association. Again, I'm always attracted to people who say two things and then you don't know what the hell they meant. And so Lanzmann says there, when people said, but surely the importance of the documentary is you had evidence, you brought the truth, you did this, you did that. I added very little to what everybody knew. It was transmission. The transmission is the important thing, the transmission. And that, I think, opened up for me here, which is why I wrote a narrative, I used it. It opened up a way of thinking about affect and transmission and its mediation. So in a way, you know, the demand for transparency, give me everything, let me see it, I need to see it. Mine might be a kind of rather a counter to that argument, which is so much when you have traumatic moments. I want it all, I want to know everything. But what do you want to know? And is the best way of knowing that sense of being face to face with the past, if you could, even if you could be face to face, or all the kind of mimetic representations which continually try to make it as real as possible? Is that the issue? You know. So it's not about being condemned to repeat, but what forms of mediation we need. And the question is an open one in the paper. The part of it is about narrative, part of it is about visuality, part of it is about mediation, part of it is about an ethics. I mean, you know, they're linked. What is the value of mediation? And how does mediation deal with the passage of time? That's the question. So it's not a curative theory, you know. If you just do X, Y, and Z, then you can cure people from this. Part of the argument, as it goes on, is a rethinking of anxiety, you know, and just to answer it briefly, Freud's second theory of anxiety as the signal. Which always, in the process of transmission, you know, not the first theory of anxiety, the second theory, less about repression and more about the anxiety, there's a sort of the anxiety sets up a signal which brings affectively the trauma and then allows at the same time, because it precedes any possible traumatic occurrence, to allow you to avoid it. But it is in the spirit, you know, it's very much in the spirit of, again, of Benjamin saying, we cannot be allowed to forget. And in that spirit, I say that we cannot say it will not happen again. Not only because, you know, there's a good chance that it won't, but because there's a good chance that it will. Also part of this book is a study of various confessions by both the victims and the Interahamwe in Rwanda. And what is interesting is a statement where somebody will give you all the socio-economic, political, what we call material reasons as to why this happened, you know, as to why the genocide took place. I give it all to you. And then there comes a moment where the narrative breaks, where there's a complete silencing of subjectivity, and there is this sense that, but we don't know why it happened, we don't know the causes of why it happened. There's a kind of qualitative difference. There's a qualitative disjunction, I would say, not even difference. We don't know why it happened. But interestingly, we don't even know the causes of why it happened here. And this repeats again and again. But that it happened here means that it will happen elsewhere, and it'll happen elsewhere in the world. Not just that it'll happen here again. You know, there's a kind of very quiet and subtle kind of global empathy there. But it's not just will happen here again, but it will happen somewhere else, and it is bound. It's that moment that I'm very keen to understand.
There's a question here and then here. Please.
Glassman has, with the then peacemakers, one witness for 12 years now in Auschwitz. for a week every year in order to bear witness to the barbarism that took place. We cannot stop bearing witness to the barbarism in order to continue our ethical search. Would you?
Oh, that's right. But I think the whole point is whether you always need to go to the place closest to you, whether you always need to go to your place. What I took away from the several testimonies from Rwanda that I read was not if somehow you are caught in going to your own place, forgive me for putting it like, not that it isn't tragic, then you're still in that realm of what I call the face-to-face. The translationality of it is very important. Not that you go back to your place, but that it takes you to someone else's place. And therefore you have also a richer historical perspective, but a psychically and psychoanalytically more interesting problem. By going to your own place, again, if I might say so, there is an emphasis on spatializing this. Whereas in a way, I think the way to deal with this, with the transmission, is by seeing how temporalities will displace, not make you forget your own necessary, but will displace that onto others and create other kinds of bonds of responsibility, even more than empathy. There is this problem of, very naturally wanting to return to your own place, but there has to be a counterforce.
Please hear, and then Dean Graham afterwards.
I wonder whether I understand you correctly that barbarism is somehow essential to the transmission of culture and civility. And I wonder if I can pick a metaphor, which would be Singapore, which is a city that has tried to repress and suppress and get rid of all barbarism, and starts to be somehow a totally uncivilized place as a result. How does this
I wasn't thinking about it quite, but I agree with you about Singapore. But I think that's, yes, I think that, that's not at the register at which I was speaking, but I would go along with you, that there was a whole, it's like, most of one's favorite friends are perverts of one kind or another, right? Perverts also in the sense that they do oppositional things, or they're opposite. Not that they're actually practicing perverts, but there is a perversity in itself is, of course, in a conference about the human, perversity is absolutely important to understand. And yes, by trying to get rid of that, they have turned Singapore into, malls where you are very perverse because you continually consume. But not barbarically.
Bill?
Sorry, no, Bill.
I'm sorry.
I think we're partially answered mine.
Okay. Yeah.
I really like that point about, throughout the point about temporality that he made, and it's a big comment in relation to that perspective of temporality, which is that if you think about the refugee kind of camps which have been in existence for 25 years, 50 years, like Sri Lanka in India, Palestine going on. One of the very interesting things is the fact that actually you do get very dense kinds of sociality, both within these camps and with populations outside. They're not necessarily, they're not necessarily visible to the law, but they're always suspect
Yes.
in relationship.
Yes.
So I'm wondering whether, in some ways, the kind of formulation in Aaron and then later in the novel, bare life, isn't actually the fact that precisely the temporality, the fact that even in place of the birth and destruction of
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why you could tell, I think, that right through the talk. Arendt, I'll come back to Arendt, but I also feel that it was not that I don't find Agamben very interesting, and I'll tell you where I do, but that is why I kept in a way of talking about the interstitial populousness of these forms of life. You see what I'm saying? Not even in the camps themselves, there is a density. There is within them again the signs of civility and perversity at the same time. So to turn these into the kind of into the models of bare life seems to me to take the air out of them. Do you see what I'm saying? And that's why I said they're in the middle of, and the Pew figures was just to demonstrate that these lives are being lived right in the midst of. And then, of course, at some point, they are distanced or sent out. But there's a conceptual point there, that they're being lived in and they are part of the density of the existence itself. And that's why I've always been a little askance about this sort of iconicity of bare life and the way in which it's been played out and accepted. Where I find Agamben interesting, and there is a sort of a comment on that, is something that I don't think he appropriately, he says, but he doesn't sort of work out. And I'll just give, since you mentioned Agamben, I'll just mention, it is about the fact that the act of witnessing is at the level of the enunciation, not at the level of énoncé, not so much in the proposition, but in the positionality of the discourse or the speech act of witnessing. So that allows you to have both, as it were, the sign or the trace of the barbaric, right, and the witnessing of it at the same time. You don't lose that affective shock. And that, I think, is a good point, but he doesn't stay with the point, and he just, moves on. But I've tried to develop that in this way.
I'm not going to mediate anymore.
Yes, please.
Well, I found the talk very challenging, and you've heard that before. Your discourse is difficult for me to follow, and especially since you're speaking so much through the words of others, Arendt and T.S. Eliot, etc. So I think I was trying to tease out your voice and what you're telling us about rethinking the human. And the only thing I can come up with that's very clear to me is that you seem to be saying that until we give secure human identity to these, I don't know if you refer to them as shadow populations, but in any case, to the undocumented, to the victims of genocide, the victims of massacre, our own humanity will remain elusive. And if that's not what you're saying, then maybe a little less elusively and even a little more superficially, how are you suggesting that we rethink the human?
Well, let me come to that. No, the whole point about the Eliot is that I was speaking in my words, not Eliot's words. And it's actually true of the Arendt too. That this is my, I hope I made that clear. That this was a reading of Eliot that was very much not the kind of way in which Eliot is read, and the citations from Eliot were not the ones where Eliotesque criticism rests its case at all. Again, the Arendt point. There's a lot of work done on the rights, on the whole idea of the right to have rights, but the other side of it, which is that if the right to have rights is universalized in a global context, then what you have is the internal autoimmune, if you like, production, the autoimmunity of barbarism. It comes from within. It doesn't come from without. That is not something that Arendtians are are necessarily very fond of. But she was thinking proleptically in a way about globalization, about certain aspects of globalization relevant today, although she thought of it more in an internationalist frame. Nor, I'm sorry to say, I've obviously got D- on all the points, because nor was I, and I'll do better next time, I promise you, nor was I suggesting that the only thing is to give secure identities, although, of course, we have to create security. I'm not somebody who believes that because I'm interested psychoanalytically in theories of ambivalence and anxiety that everybody should be shuddering all the time. Not at all. I felt that even in those figures, and this goes back to your point about bare life, not taking anybody in that kind of emblematic form, even the most distressed, and saying you can complete this, you can give them this security, and then you will produce this, this upstanding human. It was actually saying that it is only by working in and through the ambivalences, it is only by acknowledging them and working with them that you can get what I think the point I made, the phrase I used, certain forms of partial, and understanding certain partial forms of identification. And out of that partiality comes solidarity. Solidarity does not necessarily come from the construction of autonomous beings in relation to each other, but that which one lacks, that which one needs. Therefore, the frame of the talk was this kind of messianic waiting, but not exactly knowing what you are waiting for. But next time, I promise you, I will do better than that. Yeah, there's another question somewhere. Yes.
My name is Shamsul Mirza. I was born in Bombay, but I went to the Cape. Then I grew up in Madras, and then Karachi. I've been in Cambridge for 35 years. I was wondering, we are in academia, so of course we talk in academic terms. If there was somebody, say, from Badakhshan, from Afghanistan, who was sitting here and he could have understood, what you were saying or what the questioners were saying, what bearing would he think or she think that this would have on rethinking the human condition?
I would wait to hear the question from Afghanistan and not from you. I'll tell you why, and I'm not being rude here. Please accept it. Because I feel that very often in my studies of these things, we underestimate what we think people understand and what they don't understand. So I think the question that you're asking, I would rather to have the question from the Afghanistani in relation, because it's difficult for me to answer it without knowing what conditions he would be speaking from or what issues he would be choosing. How would I know that somebody from Afghanistan, what their expectations would be? It is only when they would give me a question from that perspective that I think I could make an appropriate answer to the question.
So my concern is when we are in academia and we go out of academia, this concerning part is that we never lose the academia, whichever forum we are. And mostly academicians talk in academic terms. And is there relevance for us to talk and analyze? You have said that what you said was a narration. I heard it more as a commentary on conditions which we may or may not have experienced. We, through other people's experiences or happenings which we are not involved in, are commenting on that. Am I?
No, that's not entirely true. Some of it, I think the whole central section I was absolutely personally involved in. That's why I wrote it as a first-person narrative. I don't think you heard it, sir.
No, I heard it.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
Is this talk from a book or?
It's in the process of.
The book is coming out?
Yeah.
You know what the title will be yet?
Well, we're still working on the title. I hope it'll be a global measure, but the editor doesn't think that is a catchy enough title.
And one of the things, when I was an undergraduate, I tried to study unsuccessfully a man, Kurt Lewin, who did something called topological psychology.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether you had any, your breadth of knowledge is astonishing, so I just thought you might have.
Astonishing, but not that astonishing. I don't, thank you, I really don't. But
back here.
Yes.
It's interesting how you mentioned, you talked about Arendt, who was also a lover of Heidegger.
Yeah.
And Heidegger, I think, on some of the temporality that you
Yes.
discussed. But he himself was part of the Nazi Party.
Yes.
Even after hearing about the atrocities in Nazis and being able to renounce. And for someone like him, and I'm not trying to pick on him as an individual today.
No, no, it's
I think the point I'm trying to make is he had such an incredible cognitive understanding of this aspect of being an ontological essence, but yet is not able to put it into practice himself. And I'm wondering, is there something deeper that as human beings, some kind of practices and things that we need to do in order to really transform ourselves beyond just having cognitive understanding of these issues?
I think this is this is an excellent and a very useful question. Let's begin at the beginning. You know, I don't think anybody who is involved in these issues, these cognitive issues or ontological issues or any other philosophical issues, is only involved in it, with the rational side of one's mind, or with one's cognitive, or with one's professional interests. I mean, it may not seem apparent, but clearly there is the whole person wholly attending in these. There is an affect. There's a phantasmatic structure to even the driest kind of problem solving or whatever. So there is a whole affective world that is part of the intellectual experience. So that, however, may well not translate into other forms of social and political good sense, good choice, ethical affirmative action, of various kinds. It may not translate into that. I mean, after all, the world is full of very, very knowledgeable people, Heidegger only being one of them. In Heidegger's case, there was the abstract philosophy. People might say, I wouldn't go that same way, but the abstraction of his philosophical understanding or knowledge may well have made him politically enormously harmful and foolish. But if you think about it, that somebody like Enoch Powell, the British racist, who really in the late 70s and 80s, really created a huge backlash amongst Indian and Pakistani migrants, a racist. I mean, one would say almost single-handedly, he spearheaded this incredible rash of racism and racial attacks that spread right through the country, and yet was himself a profound student and lover of Indian history and Indian philosophy. Now, where the two things don't come together is a very important question. But for Heidegger, this could be. I mean, I'm not sufficiently informed about his deep psychic life to understand why he made certain choices. Same question came up with Paul de Man years later. And I do think there is something at that level, some level of disavowal, some level of profound repression, some almost psychotic level of division. But that doesn't mean that those deep psychic responses and defenses are not then used for one's own furtherance. You see, so there is a kind of madness, if you like, and yet a kind of tremendous social canniness, a professional canniness that comes together. So the problem doesn't become simpler as I talk about it, it becomes more and more complicated. Why? But there's another way of taking it, which may or may not get us far. I won't do it today, but there's a way of thinking about some of the ontological concepts in Heidegger and beginning to work from there to see what would be the value of life, for instance, or how would certain forms of agency be constituted or not constituted, particularly in a collective context. That could be another approach. So one could be the kind of psychic, more the personal biographical approach, which is very, very difficult to plumb its depths. The other could be an approach led more by a rethinking of these works, of these events through the work. I'm not sure either of them would give you a satisfactory answer, but what they would allow you to do would be to explore the limits of the analytic tools with which one is trying to understand these questions. And also, in relation to what I said earlier, they would never let you say never again with any confidence.
Could I then ask a question to follow up on that, I think? The word of security that was used earlier, in terms of what you just said, sort of never again, never again. To be secure, one has to embrace contingency, right?
Yes. Yes, which is why the whole paper was around the question of how one has to deal with ambivalence, and that it is not basically something that paralyzes you, but requires a different way of thinking about agency and action. And yes, and contingency is very much at the heart of it. The reason why I talked about W.E.B. Du Bois was very much because he constructed a whole theory of double consciousness based on these contingent moments in which a segregated African American constructed both a personal life narrative and a public persona. And it is only through being able to understand how to work with contingency, by accepting it in the first place and work with it, that I think one begins to get a sense of what action and agency are.
And so then
because there is very often a way of casting the shadow of intentionality as some ability to preconceive an end, which is, I think, problematic.
Right. So to use other terms, your terms, the sort of caught in the interstices or in between such categories as brutality and civilization, and embracing that in terms of contingency, there's the possibility of brutality, but there's also the possibility of civilization, right?
Well, this is why I'm suggesting that you have to think the two problems together, and not to kind of separate, not to separate them out.
So this is what it means to be human. Bill, did you have a...
Yes, Bill.
I was just curious, Tony, in you're talking about the, particularly you cite things such as Abu-Lughod, for instance, one thinks also of Lila and Cali and so forth. What I wonder about is the degree to which, I experienced this also in Germany many years ago, in traveling to some of the sites with Germans behind the Iron Curtain in the early 60s. I wonder about this ability to somehow ignore what is almost what we identify with. I mean, I find the degree to which we're already forgetting Abu-Lughod, certainly in our wider culture, the degree to which Eli has passed probably almost out of memory, probably out of textbooks. How does one deal with the piece of I mean, I think we're trying to get in these last comments of somehow identifying with what we perceive as not our identity, which may be American, it might be German for some Germans and so on. How do you see that as, and particularly in the differences between barbarity and civilization? How does it work so that we actually think globally? You spoke about being global, but I think we often tend to slide back into, in this country, I think, back into identifying and therefore excusing in some sense something as anti-American or an aberration or whatever else. We have a lot of difficulty, I think, globalizing that kind of recognition, because we refuse to recognize it as something that's anything but a barbarism if it's ours. It's not really what we are. We're not that.
Yeah, but of course, that's absolutely, and but since when did ethical thinking have a kind of national ontology tied to it? I mean, that's the whole question, I mean, it doesn't mean that there aren't forms of, moral theory that don't locate themselves in some form of national territorial thinking, and not so much maybe in phenomenology or philosophy, but in public ethics. It's obviously an important issue. But it seems to me there is of course an important institutional and pedagogical argument to be made about the forces of ethical instruction or observation that come from a particular sensus communis, whether it's the national or the community or whatever. You can't, it is rooted in that, there is that. But on the other hand, there is another way of thinking. So those are the conditionalities or the conditions or causes of it. But there is another way of thinking about of identification or ethical identification, which, if it has learned anything in and through modernity, it has learned about the need to move beyond, not be beyond the national or patriotic discourse, not because that is a great sign of your empathetic generosity. Not because of that, but because the fact that the worst barbaric moments, whether it be slavery, indenture, First Nations people, questions of colonial oppression, are all shared histories, despite their asymmetries. There is no history of Britain, which is also not a history of Kenya or a history of India or history there's no history of France, which is not a history of Algeria. So it's not that these cross-border or cross-national identifications, which often demand at the instructional level deep interdisciplinarities, right? You need to think about the cultural, you need to think about the historical, all these things bear then on one's forms of ethical identification. But there is no history of the United States then, which is also not a history of My Lai or Abu Ghraib, and that's why I ended by saying that what the blogger from Baghdad was saying was not that I want every child of every policeman to suffer, but I want every child of every military policeman involved in this to know about this, to speak it in Kansas or to speak it in Louisiana. It's not a point about accusation. It is a point about making it your history and realizing the asymmetrical and disjunctive conditions within which these histories of East or West have been made. This is not a Dickensian idea, God, here am I sitting with spuds and sausages and bangers eating I should think about the starving people in India. No. It is truly about the interstitial nature of internationalism. And that's one of the reasons why I brought up this unspoken aspect of, or largely unspoken aspect of Arendt, that it is from within these global networks that you have to take responsibility for the barbarism that emerges from them. It's not coming from somewhere else. No, I'm being figurative, of course not, but I'm just saying that what sounded horrific about that, if you wanted to see it that way, was saying, I want every child and every child's child to remember Abu Ghraib. And what I'm saying was it shouldn't be seen as this kind of, this harridan making a point. It's not about that. It's about the fact that this story should be appropriated, and that's much more, but should be appropriated and circulated, which is much better. As Fanon said, I'm not interested in making one person feel guilty or one community feel guilty for what they did to me. It has to become part of the knowledge base. It has to become part of the historical fabric. It has to become part of the structure around which thinking globally, politically in this case, would be inseparable from this. But for us in the university, what is very important is that it does require studies. It does require interdisciplinary studies. It does require us rethinking what area studies are and and what the place of the humanities now is within the social sciences and the sciences and vice versa. It needs that. That's what we can do. Does that answer your question?
Ron and then Charlie?
Yeah.
I think you actually have gone a long way to answer the question that I formulated before this last answer, but let me ask it anyway to see if you want to add anything.
Thank you.
I'm fascinated by the idea of the ethics of ambivalence and attracted to the notion that aesthetic plays an important role in the shaping immoral formation. And your example of Nuremberg and the Zapellenfeld and the football stadium and the young man on the bicycle was evocative of a certain dilemma in which we find ourselves. But it seems to me that if you want to reconnect poetics and ethics, that some attention to the actual forms in which moral formation takes place,
Yes.
the practices by which agency shape and subject
Right.
shape is important. I began to speak to that in
Yes.
this last answer. I wonder, as particularly when we think about the powerful counterforces against a global context within which these practices were formed, whether you've given any further thought to the actual concrete places where this kind of moral formation can take place.
The institutional end of that argument, other than within the context, as I was saying a moment ago, within the context of a certain forms of study, certain notions of knowledge bases, certain interventionist inquiries where you least expect them, and there are many people in this room who are doing that kind of work. I think that's very important. What I have not thought about is how, for instance, places of, say, public worship, right, which I think is very important. I mean, if you think about the interwar years in Chicago, and you think about the Brownsville section, and when you think about the Brownsville section, you know that even that churches and other such community centers, in the absence of schools for blacks that of a certain were providing a huge ethical and moral education. And this is why Du Bois was not willing to have Booker T. Washington's, what would he call them? Schools for practical, what do you call them? Vocational schools, and said, every black person should read Hegel and should have the chance to read Hegel. So I think formal and informal educations of that kind, or amongst the mining communities in the 20s and 30s and 40s, the mining communities, isolated mining communities in the Midlands, in Britain, where these, there were book clubs, or there were, a nurturance of profound broadening of one's both knowledge base, but also one's ethical imagination. What I have not done, and what I don't even know if I could do, was to think more about other kinds of institutions. I think I have some idea of what the onus and obligation is on us in the humanities academia and in relation to the soft social sciences, and so on, what one would need to do. And I think, obviously, for me, the whole question of primary and secondary schools is also a very, very important thing. Questions of church. I want to say something which relates. I'm going to say something. I mean, I've said enough, sort of controversial things, but I do want to say something in response to what you said. After 9/11, and this is at some level very superficial, but I have to say this. I mean, after 9/11, I went to the gym more than I've ever been before, because there were all these banks of televisions, and I was sitting at home watching what was happening. I thought, I might as well, get fit watching what was happening, So there I used to be, and you'd have these parallel screens, and you remember there was a period where all we heard about probably true, were some of these madrasas where everybody was being trained to be a terrorist, particularly in Pakistan, where the government, of course, has substantially moved out of the educational sector. So the whole educational sector is left to groups of that kind. And here you had, this is completely impressionistic, right? This is totally off the wall. But here you had these pictures of these kids in madrasas, dressed, white hats, no doubt doing what I did when I was in school in Bombay. It's, the Jesuits made me do it, which is learn everything by heart, by rote. I was, a Jesuit product all the way through. And so that went on in one screen. And on the other screen, you would get at the same sort of time, the parade in front of some kind of spurious quack psychologist or quack judge. The parade of black or Mexican poor people being brought up there for these show trials that you have on television. She slept with, I'm her mother. This girl of 12 slept with my boyfriend. I'm 60, my boyfriend is 30, she's 12. Isn't it horrible? You know what I'm saying? I just thought, what the hell is going on? Ask me whether I want to send my child to a madrasa or I send my child to a madrasa any day. And then do whatever damage limitation I had to do at home. But it just struck me, when you asked that question, this image, rather like in that Benjaminian way where he says, you have this zeitgeist, the flash of the moment. I kept thinking, I used to be horrified time, and it was always the poor, it was always the overweight. It was always the addicted of some kind. It was always those who never had any proper educational facilities. They were brought up as television fodder. And then the side-by-sideness of it. Look at those poor indoctrinated youth and look at our kids. I don't want to draw anything from this, but I just want to say it. I need to say it.
Charlie? Just wanted to ask one maybe follow-up question on what Bill Graham was asking on the transmission of barbarism.
Yeah.
And how we think about barbarism might be transmitted both as a practice versus an image. So the images of what happened at Abu-Lughod can be seen, according to historians of torture in the Philippines, that there's a red line between techniques of torture that were developed by American military police in the Philippines and then transmitted in practices of the military right to Abu-Lughod. And so that we can see that those practices were transmitted, that they weren't an expression of some human barbaric nature, but they were taught and people learned them and they were transmitted over decades. So I just wonder, is it that what Riverbend is urging, this kind of transmission of barbarism in memory and mediation through images, so they have the power perhaps in some surprising way to undo the ability of the practices of barbarism to be transmitted in the way that they need to be under darkness. And then to add to that is whether our own fixation on 9/11 cloaks so that it seems like this is day one, everything is new, and we're unable to see how our own society, our own institutions have been transmitting barbarism because we began on this one as if it's day one.
But who doesn't see it except, I think, for a very small group of, I don't know who doesn't see. I mean, if you read the testimonies of the people in Abu Ghraib, they are very clear that this also, not only from the Philippines, but from Guantanamo. Many of the people were sent directly from Gitmo, as they put it, trained in Gitmo and sent to Abu Ghraib. Yeah, no, I know it can go from 1920, but probably you could go much earlier too. I mean, not in this particular form. So absolutely, I think one of the points of that Riverbend was making was precisely that. Not to anesthetize by repetition, but to be able to relocate, recite by repetition, Not so that this happens again, of course, but that one knows what it is, what an institution is also capable of, what a state is capable of, not simply individuals. That's why in my talk I was very much balanced between, these are not individual stories. This was between apparatuses of narrative or structure or larger communicative structures. These are not stories of one person. I mean, Eliot was not simply a poet's subjective voice. It was, as I said, a particular moment of modernity. Or that Arendt, for me, was not simply about one woman's thought, but about a particular position at a particular time. And I think that clearly Riverbend's idea was not simply, as I said, like a harridan to chase these 8 or 9 people, but to talk about a particular structure of a power and a particular structure of barbarism, and the way in which the recognition of that and its relocation in a way from where it came would change that. So it's not a pox on your house, but it is a new way of relocating the population in relation to these things. And of course, it's not limited to the United States. I mean, if you think of Gujarat in India and what happened times ago, anywhere. But I think it's also important at times, and I tried to parse my paper that way, to stay with a moment before moving on, rather than a way in which very often there's a kind of narrative of universalism which says, all these practices are terrible. We're all in it. Each practice has its own condition of recognizability, its own location, and I think it's important to emphasize that.
Last question?
I wonder if you could say a bit more about the role of time in the ethics of ambivalence, because in many of the examples that you gave, there actually seem to be incommensurable understandings of time in relationship to, and one of the things one might say makes us nervous in this messianic time we're living in is we're not used to it in the American cultural ethos. It attends on our worries about the immigrants, right? They come on an ethos of progress and a better future that we've forgotten in our own cultural past. And it seems to me that swirling around many of the comments you made was a strong sense of the temporal in the ethics of ambivalence and moral formation. I just wonder if you could say.
Well, I mean, that was, as I said in my opening comments, that was exactly where I was going, and that's what I wanted to emphasize. And it seems to me that what ambivalence, what the temporality of ambivalence does is question synchronicity. And it also questions the possibility of being able to stand back. That's why I quoted the Rorty, to be able to stand back and look, because you are part of the movement yourself.
But you also want to look, in response to another question, you said something about working through the ambiguities of the stateless. Or the you want to, no, sorry, what I said was that there's often an understanding that ambivalence is like ambiguity, whereas it's precisely not. But in value pluralist decisions and judgments, it's not, the ambivalence is not cutting out the other thing, but the other thing which is creating a counterforce, but understanding that the decision has to be made in relation to the movement between these two forces. And it's there that the question of incommensurability and aporia emerge. And somehow, very often, there is a sense in which, just as we don't anymore believe in an equal playing field, even if it were possible, there is still a sense, often, particularly in a more public discourse, that it is necessary to have a kind of synchronous space of ethical judgment. And here, my suggestion, my plea is that if you did that, then the complexity of what creates the problem itself is not faced. And that's why I actually emphasized the time aspect. So it's not always, it's not forever, but always. It's visible and invisible.
It can be visible or invisible. It can become recognizable at a particular time, and it can recede at another time. And that ethical vigilance requires you to be aware of all those systems of both oppression and how to create a judgment around them. Somebody who I found very interesting on this is Joseph Raz, the legal philosopher, who always talks about the importance of the ethical object as it is constituted in the ambivalence when there is a question of value pluralism involved.
Thank you very much. Please join me.
Thank you.